So now I get to introduce Andrew Roberts. We put it together. He helped me. He has an excellent memory for dates, better than I. We think it was in 2003 when I met him. He gave a talk at the Travelers Club at a Hillsdale College event over there, and Doug Jeffrey found him, and I didn't know who he was really. And he started talking, and he was this brilliant young man. And the first thought I had was, wow, he's not crazy. Highly educated, Keyes College, Cambridge, historian, and he isn't nuts. And he's gone on to great strength. He's written some important books. He's written a history of the English-speaking people. He's written 2 books that qualify him for his most recent book magnificently, and one is he wrote a biography of Edward Halifax, Lord Irwin and then Lord Halifax, who was very important in the life of Winston Churchill, often opposed, often in close cooperation. And so Andrew knows that part. Edward Halifax is the man who sat in the room with Winston Churchill and Neville Chamberlain when they decided who would be prime minister in 1940. That's a significant connection. And Andrew looked at all that from that side first. And then Andrew has written a book called Eminent Churchillians, and it's modeled after a 1923, I think it is, famous book called Eminent Victorians, and it's all about the people who were in the government and how they related to each other and what they did, but also what they did in relation to each other, their diaries and their letters and their romances, sometimes not inside the sanctity of matrimony. And so he put all that together, and I commend the book to you. It's dazzling. And I remember as I was reading it through, I'd think, how did he find out all that stuff? And then he had this last great qualification to write about Churchill, who's half American, and that is his father was the franchisee of Kentucky Fried Chicken in United Kingdom, and that means he understands the difference between regular and extra crispy. Now you're ready to write about Churchill. It's so hard to write about Churchill because he's, it's just there isn't anything like him. When I picked Churchill, I was advised by a great teacher, pick some great person and some great book, and by the time you're done, be able to say you know as much about it as anybody alive. And I was so ignorant, I didn't understand that if you pick Churchill, the volume in comparison to, say, Lincoln or Washington is just massively more. And so, here am I, an old man now, having more or less got through it. But it's hard to do that, right? And so to write a biography of him, to take all that and render it into a microcosm, which is what it's got to be. The book is 1,000 pages long, and I promise you'll enjoy every page of it. It's fun. Churchill was exciting. Hitler is exciting. And, Hitler. History is exciting. Hitler is exciting. Why do I think, I was about to say a point about it, but it is true. Hitler is exciting. And therefore, the fellow who was responsible more than any other fellow for his downfall is exciting. And those are great, traumatic, turning points events that stand important in the whole history of the human race. And how do you take all that about a man who wrote 50 books of his own, roughly, and render it into some kind of coherence and not lose the fun of it? Almost no one has ever done that. I would say no one, except that I used to work for Martin Gilbert and have a great loyalty to him. But Andrew Roberts has done that. Bless him for it.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be invited to address you, and thank you very much indeed, Larry, for those tremendously kind words. And it's so wonderful to see quite so many people here as well. I once gave a speech at the Sevenoaks Literary Festival in Kent, where fewer people turned up than there were oaks. When Larry invited me to speak about the importance of Winston Churchill today, it was 6 months ago, and I don't think that even he could have spotted his own prescience, because in the last week, or 2 weeks in fact, Winston Churchill has been turned into a political football in my country. And the deputy leader of the Labour Party, John McDonnell, who has always prided himself on his Marxism-Leninism, has accused Winston Churchill of being a villain. And one can imagine, therefore, the response, very pleased to say most of it negative, but unfortunately some people, including Mayor Sadiq Khan of the Mayor of London, has generally come out also highly critical of Churchill. The week before that, we had a 24-year-old Green MP from the Scottish Parliament call Winston Churchill a war criminal and a warmonger. Why anybody was expecting any sense from a 24-year-old Green member of the Scottish Parliament anyhow, I'm not sure, but nonetheless. And in your country, a little over 2 months ago, the astronaut Scott Kelly, who is, of course, the UN ambassador to space, only the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, would want to have an ambassador to somewhere that has no people and no government, said that Churchill was also I think the phrase was a racist warmonger. He didn't bother to educate himself. He didn't bother to read any books about Churchill or to learn about Churchill, learn the truth at all. He just came out with that remark. I really do feel that the space he ought to concentrate in is the one between his ears. So I think it's worthwhile just to go back, just to remind ourselves why Winston Churchill does, in fact, still have contemporary relevance today, why he is important today. And it's not because, of course, of the actual battles that he fought in British domestic politics. Frankly, what happened in the Tonypandy riot, what happened with the Black and Tans, what happened with the gold standard or the abdication crisis, or even the Dardanelles expedition. Those are 100 years old. They are all in the past. They are all long dead and buried. However, the reason that he still matters today is because of the truths that he told, because of the leadership that he showed, because of the personality that he was, and above all, because of the foresight that he showed, the qualities that we still need in leaders just as much today as ever we have done in the past, because of the eloquence that he used to make people listen to him who didn't want to and who didn't agree with him, and because of the moral and indeed the physical courage that he showed as well. These are qualities, ladies and gentlemen, and of course Winston Churchill himself said of courage that it was rightly esteemed the first of all the qualities because it guarantees all the others. And these are the qualities, therefore, that we have every right still to, in a democracy, to look for in our leaders, and which, therefore, are just as important as ever they were before, and perhaps more important now today than ever before. I'd like to take you back to the evening of Friday the 10th of May, 1940, when Winston Churchill was made Prime Minister by King George VI at Buckingham Palace. And he, of course, it was the evening of the same day that Adolf Hitler had unleashed blitzkrieg on the West, invading Holland and Belgium and Luxembourg, shortly afterwards, of course, also to invade France. And it was of that day that Winston Churchill famously wrote in his first volume, The Gathering Storm, of his autobiography, of his war memoirs, should I say. I felt as if I were walking with destiny and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And this was so true. All of his past life, the speeches that now cover 8,000 pages, the jobs that he had as First Lord of the Admiralty, of course, before the First World War and during the First World War and in the Second World War, the being Chancellor of the Exchequer and Home Secretary and Minister of Munitions in charge of 2.5 million people in the munitions factories. These were indeed a preparation for his hour and his trial. But what I also try to do in my book is to look at the beginning part of that sentence, the bit about walking with destiny. Because there, too, you see something which is important for Churchill and the way that we should look at him today. Because it is impossible to understand Churchill, ladies and gentlemen, unless you understand that he also had this sense, this driving sense of personal destiny. He was 16 years old when he told his best friend at Harrow, Winston Churchill was almost entirely self-educated owing to the fact that he had to be because he went to Harrow, that there were going to be terrible struggles, great upheavals in his life, in both of their lives, in the life of the nation, and that he was going to be called upon to save England and to save London. And he said that at the age of 16. And everything that happened to him after that, all the close brushes with death that he had, the many close brushes with death, underpin this sense of personal destiny. And so when he was born prematurely, 2 months prematurely, a close brush with death in late Victorian England, when he was stabbed at the age of 10 years old in the stomach by a school friend, clearly not a very close friend, when he nearly died at the age of 11, when he nearly died of pneumonia, on which occasion, by the way, the doctors administered brandy to the 11-year-old, both orally and rectally, which you would have thought might have put you off brandy for life, but didn't in Winston Churchill's case. He was only a little bit older when he survived a near drowning on Lake Geneva. He survived a house fire that burnt down the stately home that he was sleeping in at 3 o'clock in the morning. He was involved in 2 plane crashes, 3 car crashes. On the front of my book, there is the wonderful Josef Karsch photograph of him in 1941, and you could see this huge scar down the center of his head and his forehead. And that came as a result of him trying to cross the road in Fifth Avenue in New York and being an Englishman looking in the wrong direction. And those, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, are only the peacetime close brushes with death. In wartime, he also took part in the greatest cavalry charge of the British Empire at the Battle of Omdurman, where no fewer than 25% of his regiment, the 21st Lancers, were either killed or wounded. And then the following year, his armoured train was attacked by the Boers in the South African War, and on that occasion, 34% of his unit were killed or wounded. And then 2 months later, he escaped from a prisoner of war camp and crossed 300 miles of enemy territory. At one point, he hid down a mine shaft, and when the candle guttered out, he could feel rats scurrying over his face. And then in the First World War, he entered no man's land no fewer than 30 times. Now, he didn't need to. He was Lieutenant Colonel of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. He could have stayed back at battalion headquarters if he'd wanted to. But he didn't, because he never believed that he should ever ask anybody in his regiment to do anything he wasn't willing personally to do himself. And so he got so close to the German trenches, he could actually hear them speaking in their trenches. And then on one occasion, of course, he left his dugout in the front line, and 5 minutes after he left it, a German whiz-bang high explosive came and decapitated everybody in the dugout. And on that occasion, he said that he felt as if he could hear the beating of invisible wings over him. Invisible wings, obviously, taking care of him, ensuring that he was going to survive in order to save London and to save England. When you look actually at theologically at his belief in the Almighty, he did believe in the Almighty. When you look into his belief in the Almighty, it seemed primarily to the duty of the Almighty was to take care of Winston Churchill. What this gave him, what this extraordinary sense of personal destiny gave him, was a calmness, an amazing calmness in the greatest and most terrifying, most perilous moments of my country's history. And he was able to make jokes. In the House of Commons, when he was being attacked during a confidence motion, so theoretically the entire government was at stake, and he made a joke when he was being attacked on the completely useless A-22 tank. And he said that when the defects and the teething troubles of the A-22 tank were apparent to all, it was appropriately rechristened the Churchill. And the key word in that, of course, is appropriately, because Winston Churchill knew that he had teething troubles and defects. He had got so many things wrong. He'd got women's suffrage wrong. He'd got the gold standard wrong. He'd got the abdication crisis wrong. Primarily, of course, he'd got the Dardanelles expedition wrong. A brilliant concept, an absolutely brilliant idea to get the Royal Navy from the Eastern Mediterranean through the Dardanelles Straits into the Sea of Marmara and to have anchored it off Istanbul, then called Constantinople, and by the threat of shelling to have taken the Ottoman Empire out of the Central Powers in the First World War. Had it come off, ladies and gentlemen, it would have been one of the greatest coups in the history of warfare. As it happened, because of the implementation of it, not by him, but by the admirals, he was back in London, the Allies lost 6 ships on that day, the 18th of March, 1915, and then it was they doubled down on the defeat, as it were, and undertook a huge invasion, amphibious assault on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the western side of the Straits, which was ultimately, over the next 8 months, to cost the Allies 147,000 killed and wounded. And this was entirely blamed on Winston Churchill, even though he was not the only person in favour of it. But he was certainly the primary scapegoat of it. People shouted at him, what about the Dardanelles, well into the 1930s. But one of the wonderful things about Winston Churchill, and one of the reasons that he is so relevant still today, is that he learnt from his mistakes. He learnt from each of his mistakes. The lesson he learnt, of course, from the Dardanelles was never to overrule the chiefs of staff during the Second World War. If all 3 of the chiefs of staff agreed on something, he did not overrule them, even though he had every constitutional right to do so. He was the Minister of Defence as well as the Prime Minister. And so you have, therefore, somebody who, a politician who learns from his mistakes. He didn't have an easy childhood. His father, the aloof, disdainful, mercurial, but brilliant Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Randolph Churchill, was somebody who never spotted any brilliance in his son, and was harsh to him. In fact, in my book, there are letters that he wrote to his son that no father should ever write to any son. And yet, Winston Churchill, especially when his father died at the age of 45, when Churchill was 20, he adored his father. He wrote his father's 2-volume biography. He was able to name his son Randolph. He quoted his father endlessly in speeches. He sought out his father's friends. He adopted his father's political views, the Tory democracy of Benjamin Disraeli. In 1947, he actually believed that he had met his father's ghost, and they talked. And in the course of their long conversation, he never let on to his father that he'd been instrumental in helping win the Second World War. So you can see in that a sense that Winston Churchill's career was bound up with attempting to impress the shade of his long-dead father. His mother, too, was almost un-American in the way that born, of course, in Brooklyn, but almost un-American in the way that she showed no interest in her son. And in 1884, in the first 6 months of 1884, when Churchill was 9 years old, she only saw him for about 6.5 hours. And there, too, Churchill refused to allow that to be a debilitating factor in his life, just like with his relationship with his father. And he loved his mother, and he said in My Early Life, his autobiography, that she shone for me like the evening star, brilliant, but at a distance. He was almost entirely broke all his life. This was partly his own fault, of course, partly because his parents were spendthrifts, but also because he was always satisfied, as his great friend F.E. Smith said, with the best of everything. But when he, for the first moment in his life that he ever made any money, when he was in his early 70s, the thing he did, and this was, of course, as a result of signing the contract to his war memoirs, the first thing he did was to buy the first of 37 racehorses, which he and he put his jockeys into his father's racing colours. And the key thing to remember, I think, in all of this is that he was not therefore to be seen. You should never see Winston Churchill as the buttoned-up Victorian aristocrat of his age and class and background. He was not that. He was instead a throwback to an earlier era. He was a regency figure, a romantic figure, somebody who was willing to wear his heart on his sleeve. In the course of the Second World War, there were no fewer than 50 times when he burst into tears in public. 50. I sometimes think that if Theresa May, who, by the way, has every right to burst into tears, were to burst into tears in public, how on earth that would affect us? But with Churchill, people didn't mind because they recognised that he was a different kind of figure and a true regency figure. I don't believe for a moment that he was a depressive, as has been made out. He chaired the Defence Committee of the War Cabinet no fewer than 1,000 times during the Second World War. Depression is a debilitating illness. But the only time that he ever used the phrase black dog was in July 1911 when he was writing to his wife Clementine at a time when that phrase was used by Edwardian matrons and governesses to explain their ill-tempered children. I don't believe that he had that or indeed manic depression or, as I've seen in some biographies, bipolar disease. Neither do I think that he was an alcoholic. He certainly drank an enormous amount, there's no doubt about that, but he had this iron constitution for alcohol. Only once in the whole 2,194 days of the Second World War was Churchill drunk. And in a meeting that went on until 3 o'clock in the morning on the 7th of March 1944, and on that occasion what they did was to just hold the meeting again the next morning, pretending that the last one hadn't happened. His friend C.P. Scott said of Churchill that Winston Churchill couldn't have been an alcoholic because no alcoholic could have drunk that much. There was a wonderful moment where, after the war, and indeed after his retirement, Churchill used to invite people to Chartwell to come and see the library and the study and the drawing room. And they get to the drawing room at the end, and Churchill would invite his guests to have a drink. And 2 American Mormons were invited, and he invited them to have a drink. And one of them said to him, "Strong drink rageth, and stingeth like a serpent. And Winston Churchill replied, I've long been looking for a drink like that. So how was it? How was it, ladies and gentlemen, that he was the person, and this goes back again to the kind of leadership that is just as relevant today as ever it was before. How was it that he was able to show such extraordinary foresight? Not just foresight before the Second World War, which we all know about, the foresight to spot Hitler and the Nazis for what they were, but also before the First World War, when he was able to spot Prussian militarism for the danger it posed, and also after the Second World War, when in his great speech, in the Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri in March 1946, he also warned the world about Stalin and the threats of Soviet imperialism to Eastern Europe. I think it comes very much from three things, especially with regard to Hitler and the Nazis. The first was that he was a Philosemite. He liked Jews, he admired them for their contribution to the ethics of Western civilization. He'd grown up with them, his father had liked Jews, he'd been on holiday with them, he represented them in one of his constituencies, and he therefore had an early warning system that was not vouchsafed to many of the other people of his age and class and background on the conservative benches, many of whom were anti-Semitic. The second thing was that he was an historian. One of the reasons that I'm proud to be an historian is that Winston Churchill was one. And he was able to put the threat made by the Nazis and Hitler into the long continuum of British history. The dangers, the hegemonistic threat to the balance of power in Europe was something that we had seen before, and he knew that. We'd seen it with Philip II of Spain and the Spanish Armada. We'd seen it with Louis XIV of France and the War of Austrian Succession, which, of course, his own great ancestor, John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, had been instrumental in defeating. We'd seen it with Napoleon, who he admired for his ambition and he admired for his sense of destiny, but who he also appreciated posed an hegemonistic threat. And then, of course, the Kaiser, who he'd fought against himself, and then Hitler. And the third thing, ladies and gentlemen, is that he had seen fanaticism in his life. He had come up close and personal to the kind of fanaticism on the northwest frontier in India and in the Sudan, which was, of course, in this case, religious Islamic fundamentalist fanaticism, but was the same thing as the religious fanaticism of the Nazis in so many ways. And that also was not something that had ever affected people like the prime ministers of the 1930s, like Ramsay MacDonald and Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain. They had never seen fanaticism in their life. And so you have these things together, the three things together, coming together and allowing Winston Churchill to have this extraordinary prescience. And he also, because he had this prescience and because he had this background and because he had this self-belief and this sense of destiny, he also was able to ignore opinion polls, to not hire a spin doctor or a speechwriter in his life, to take no notice of focus groups, to actually, what you got from Winston Churchill, you knew you had straight from him. And on top of all of these things, the ability to learn from his mistakes, this extraordinary physical courage, a moral courage also, that he was able to be shouted down in the House of Commons, his seat nearly taken away from him by the Conservative Party after the Munich Agreement, lambasted and attacked and ridiculed by the press, and he did not change his message that we needed to rearm, especially in the air. And that kind of leadership, ladies and gentlemen, needed only one more thing in order to make it unbelievably powerful, and that was, of course, his eloquence. And he got his eloquence by hard work, by practice, by reading Macaulay and reading Gibbon and knowing Shakespeare back to front. There's a marvellous moment in the Second World War where he has a competition with Field Marshal Smuts about who knows Shakespeare the more. And after about a quarter of an hour, Smuts had to give up. And then a little bit later on, he realised that actually Churchill was making it up. Yeah, can you imagine trying to make up iambic pentameters? But because of this extraordinary work that he had put into it, when his brother officers were relaxing in the heat of the sun in India at Bangalore in the late 1890s, but he was reading. He managed, therefore, to create phrases that will live as long as our tongue survives. He was once asked during the war by his private secretary how it was, what were the tricks of the trade, what were the techniques that you use in order to create these extraordinary morale-boosting speeches. And he said, well, there were 4 things. The first was that each sentence needs to convey one idea and one idea only. Don't be bogged down with subclauses and so on. What he called that noble thing, the English sentence. And the second thing was, therefore, keep sentences as short as possible, keep words as long as possible. If you're not attempting to show off that you know a long word, use the right word, and it's often the shortest word. And also, he said, try and use Anglo-Saxon words, Old English words, words that the English-speaking peoples feel comfortable with and know instinctively because they've been using them for 1,000 years. And if you therefore look at the peroration, that last paragraph of the great We Shall Fight on the Beaches speech of the 4th of June 1940, about when he was telling the British people what they were going to do when the paratroopers started landing and when the ships started landing in southern England. And he told the British people that they were going to fight on the beaches and the landing grounds and in the hills and the streets, and fight with growing confidence in the air, and that they were never going to surrender. When you look at that peroration paragraph of 141 words, all but 2 of them are in Old English. They come from the Dictionary of Old English. The only 2 exceptions being the word confidence, which comes from the Latin, and surrender, which comes from the French. You did ask an Englishman here, ladies and gentlemen. So to conclude, a man of extraordinary physical courage, and indeed that didn't stop, of course, in the Second World War either. Winston Churchill travelled 110,000 miles outside the United Kingdom as Prime Minister. He was the person who therefore, and think of that travel, it was often in unpressurized cabins, he was in his early 70s, very often it was within the radius of the Luftwaffe. When he came back from the United States on one occasion, his plane was struck by lightning. Had the instrumentation gone down, so would he have. And when he took ships, it was across U-boat-infested oceans. The sheer courage of that. And, of course, it was necessary because he was the glue that kept the big 3 together. President Roosevelt, of course, was profoundly disabled. He was still able to leave the American continent 3 times during the war. Marshal Stalin did not enjoy flying. He didn't like flying. He was a bit scared of flying. He stayed. He only left the Soviet Union once during the Second World War. And so it took Winston Churchill to visit Moscow twice, to visit Washington several times, Quebec and so on, Cairo, Casablanca. The sheer amount of time that he spent traveling showed in tremendous guts on his part. And of course he was ill. He had a minor heart flutter in the White House when he was staying for 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor in the White House. He had several bouts of pneumonia. On one occasion in May 1943 in Carthage, a doctor came to him and asked him for some blood for testing. And Churchill said, yes, well, you can take some from my ear or my finger. And I also have an almost infinite expanse of arse. So there you have, just to conclude, a man of extraordinary courage, both physical and moral, a man of the capacity for foresight that, in my view, puts all of the other mistakes he made, the trivial mistake, they make all of those mistakes trivial. But he was somebody who could learn from his mistakes and did. And then also that, on top of everything else, that eloquence. And as a result, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, you have somebody who was able to go beyond even what he had predicted and prescribed for himself as a 16-year-old schoolboy, because he was not just able to save London and England, he also saved civilization itself. Thank you very much. Some questions?
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Roberts. We do have time for some questions. I should mention that Andrew will be signing copies of his New York Times bestseller, Churchill Walking with Destiny, right after this Q&A session out in the lobby. But we do have some time for some questions now from the audience. We have microphones with students, or students with microphones. Students bringing the microphones around. Please wait for a microphone. And
thank you very much for your speech. Enjoyed it. I enjoyed. I didn't read your book. I downloaded it audibly, listened to it.
That's much better, by the way.
Your narrator is very good, and I like the voice that he had for Winston itself, so you could tell who it was.
I'll tell the actor. That's very
So
kind.
there's all kinds of questions. I have a little tiny one, and that is Halifax. During that meeting in May, he said he didn't want to be prime minister, but then there's a theory that he really wanted Winston to take it, and he knew he would sign the peace agreement with Churchill, and then he would become. Is there any truth to that?
I go into this in a great deal of detail deliberately in this book, because there are so many different sources about this, and they don't all agree. And I think that Winston Churchill's own memory of this, where he gets the day wrong and the time wrong for this, and also sort of claims that the premiership fell into his lap through a long silence that he claims took place, it just doesn't ring true for me at all. And I think some of the other sources make it a little bit more clear that what Winston Churchill actually did at 4:30 in the afternoon on Thursday, the 9th of May 1940, was to do what he had always done in his career, which was to ask for the office that he took. And he knew the crisis. He knew he'd been waiting for this for 40 years anyway. He'd wanted the premiership all his life, and this was going to be his great moment. And the idea that he sat back and waited it to fall into his lap just doesn't ring true to me at all. I think he demanded it. And he had every right to, because he was the only person who had been proved right about Adolf Hitler over the previous 10 years. And Lord Halifax, and certainly David Margesson, somebody else who was in this room, who was the chief whip, and Neville Chamberlain himself, of course, had all been proved wrong. And so I'd be interested to hear what you and other readers feel about my chapter 19, which for me is really the key one. I think that that's what happened.
I want to ask a question which does not involve huge political Churchill, but one of the paragraphs in your early chapters, which I've read the whole book, said English imperialism in India was wrong. And then you said Churchill believed that England had brought railroads, roads, but most importantly, an uncorrupt judicial system, a administration that was and ended sati, and it had a whole paragraph of things that Churchill thought were good for India. And then at the end of that paragraph, you said, but of course imperialism was wrong. And I thought that was satire. I just was curious. Was that your point or not?
There really ought to be a special font for irony. Next question.
Over on this side. Dr. Roberts, on this side. Yes, sir. There was a whimsical story I heard once when Winston was visiting the White House, and I'd like you to debunk it, if you might, that Mr. Churchill had a habit at times of not wearing a stitch of clothing, and that the president walked in on him, and Winston, without skipping a beat, said, "Let it be known that the Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." Would you confirm or deny that, sir?
Absolutely confirm it. It comes from Patrick Faller, who was one of Churchill's secretaries, and it's very much in the canon. Yes, it did happen.
When he was turned out of office, how did he handle that? And we've heard it was war weariness on the part of the British people, but it was a turn towards socialism. And how long was he in a funk about that, or did he immediately snap out of it?
Winston Churchill was never in a funk about anything. He snapped out of it immediately. The defeat in the 1945 general election on the 26th of July came as a surprise to him because he had been treated by huge crowds with great enthusiasm all the way through the general election, especially the crowds in the Midlands and in the North. And he had a terrible shock on the day. If there had been a presidential system, he would undoubtedly have won that election. But of course, we have a parliamentary one, and he was only one person, one name on 650 ballots. And the Conservative Party was going to be punished for appeasement. Many people also did want the what they thought of as the New Jerusalem of socialism, the welfare state, the National Health Service, all the things that they thought were going to come an awful lot cheaper than they ultimately did. And when Clementine, Churchill's wife, said to him on that day, as the results were coming in, and it was clear there was a landslide against him, that it might be a blessing in disguise, Winston Churchill replied, "Well, from where I'm sitting, it seems quite effectively disguised." Question has to be asked, though, on whether or not it was a blessing in disguise, because ultimately Churchill was exhausted by the end of the war. The kind of things that he would have needed to have dealt with regard to austerity and the end of empire and so on, were not things that he was excited or interested about. And he was able to recharge his batteries over the following 6 years. He went on painting holidays to Lake Como and France, and Marrakesh and elsewhere. And by the end of it, he was able to come back and win the 1951 general election, which, considering the massive defeat that he'd experienced in 1945, was an extraordinary achievement. So maybe actually Clementine was right, and it was indeed a blessing in disguise. Although not for the British people, I hasten to add, because we've still got the National Health Service to this day, and it is an appalling incubus.
Thank you for your speech tonight. Considering the environment we find ourselves in today, with all the talking heads out there willing to give their insight and wisdom, including former presidents, knowing Winston Churchill as well as you do, what do you think he would say to Donald Trump in his battle against his own party, the entrenched deep state, and those people who really just aren't supportive of him? What do you think he would say today?
I think that well, first of all, Mary Soames, Churchill's daughter, always used to say to me and others, never assume that you know what Papa would have said under any circumstances, especially not half a century after his death. I think it would have been very difficult with Churchill in modern-day politics, although, well, not least because he smoked 160,000 cigars and drank a good deal and other things that would have worked against him as a modern-day politician. With regard to, and that's a British politician, let alone an American one. Nonetheless, I think he was very, very good at using all the latest technology. I think he'd have been brilliant on Twitter, for example. He was so good. Many of his great riposts would have fitted in perfectly to 280 characters or fewer. There was a time when he was giving a speech and someone shouted "rot" at him. And he replied, "I'd like to thank the honourable member for telling us what's in his mind." That certainly would have fitted into 280 characters. Question from over here? Is there? Sorry, I thought I saw one.
Okay.
The gentleman here?
Oh.
Sir.
Winston Churchill, as well as Franklin Roosevelt, and many other great leaders have come from the higher echelons of society, privileged in their upbringing. But of course, we have the dichotomy of Abraham Lincoln, who came from the lowest level. What do you think is the inspiration or the cause of such leadership? It's obviously not based on upbringing. It must be based on some other element that makes them so great.
Yes, that's a very good question. Certainly not upbringing, or indeed social class. Winston Churchill was an aristocrat. He was born in a palace, and not just any old palace, a palace that the royals envy. He was the grandson of a duke, of course, and he had this sense of noblesse oblige. Now, today, I'm afraid he would be attacked as having a sense of entitlement. But actually, the kind of entitlement that he had was the best possible kind. The idea that you had privileges in life, but it was your duty to spend your entire life returning to the people the energies that you had in your existence. And so it was something that was tremendously powerful, not just in British politics, but of course he extended it also to the empire, and believed that was a sacred trust that needed to take the lives and the energies and the effort of millions of Britons. And I think, therefore, actually there is something very modern, if it could be properly harnessed, in that kind of attitude towards life. And it doesn't in any way have to come from any particular class whatsoever. But I do think that it would be a shame if we were to basically cut out from politics anyone who's had a privileged upbringing, because of this ghastly sense of the opposite of envy and because envy is the most barren of all the vices, and it's something that socialism builds on and sucks out, and makes it really makes people feel that just because somebody's had a privileged background, that they have nothing to contribute. And yet the great Renaissance men and women of history have not come from any particular social class at all. So I think I'm with you in what I suspect is your question. I think that it's a terrible new idea, this idea of somebody being so entitled that they can't contribute to society. Of course they can, and they must. Got a couple more questions, and then I'm going to end with a Churchill joke, if that's all right. Gentleman here.
Two questions related. Did Churchill have friends? And secondly, did he live a lonely life as busy as it was?
He had lots of friends. He had lots of great friends. He was a man who had a special talent. Indeed, I would argue a genius for friendship. When one looks at the relationships that he had with people like Professor Lindemann or F.E. Smith or Brendan Bracken, or most of the members of the club that he set up of his friends called the Other Club, one realizes that he was a man who had a tremendous capacity for friendship. And this came from several areas. First of all, his wonderful sense of humor, of course, which was gigantic. Also, his a belief in sticking by his friends, even if it hurt him politically. He was willing to, so long as they behaved honourably, of course. He would put up with any amount of bad behaviour from his friends. Frankly, there's a rule in the Other Club which states that. Nothing in this club shall interfere with the asperity and rancour of party politics. And so he was able to make friends from outside his own political party, which was very lucky considering he changed his party twice, famously saying that anyone can rat, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat. And so yes, no, he did. Was he lonely? I don't believe he was lonely for a moment. No, he partly because of his friends, and partly also because of his wife Clementine, who was his rock, and he was fascinated, of course, by politics, and could always pick up the phone to anybody that he wanted to. He was a man who was capable of being on his own. And that was a good thing too, because he wrote, as Larry said, he wrote the best part of 50 books, 980 articles. He was somebody who needed to be on his own in order to work, but he was capable of being alone but not lonely, and I think that's one of the great attributes in life.
We have time for one more question.
After World War II, we saw the sense of Englishness and the duty of the Englishman decline. We saw the empire decline. Was that a material thing? Was that a cultural thing? Or was that a lack of leadership that someone like Churchill might have been able to change had he been a younger man at that time? Or was it just the sunset of an empire after an exhausting series of world wars?
I think it was very much the last of those. Although culturally, of course, socialism did suck the lifeblood out of the empire as well, because the Attlee government wanted to be rid of India. Nonetheless, by the end of the Second World War, maybe we could have survived one world war, but two, within a quarter of a century, it was asking too much of anyone. And yet, if an empire, a great empire, an empire in which a quarter of which at one stage had covered about a fifth of the world land surface, was ever going to decline and die, as ours did, as the British Empire did, in what more noble cause could it possibly die than in the defeat of Nazism? If it had to go, that was the way to go, an honourable way to go, I think. Ladies and gentlemen, just one Churchill gag that I'd like to tell you. My favourite Churchill gag always changes from time. There are about 200 Churchill jokes in this book, and so obviously they change from time to time. But the one that I particularly love at the moment is the moment when his private secretary came to him in the early 1950s and told him that their cook had been made pregnant as the result of a nocturnal assignation with a man in the street in Verona. And Winston Churchill immediately replied, "Obviously not one of the two gentlemen." Thank you very much indeed.